Hi, I'm Alexandra and welcome to the first official video on the PsychE-Learning channel. Yesterday we posted an introductory video just kind of about who we are and what our goals are for this channel, so feel free to go check that out if you haven't already. And for today, I'll be discussing the different branches of psychology. There are 16 in total, which is quite a lot for one video, so don't worry, we split it up. I'll be doing the first half today, and Hesna will be doing the other half on Friday. In future videos, we will discuss more specific concepts and theories, and if you have any requests, we are more than happy to take them and, just kind of delve into what they are about exactly. But right now, I just kind of wanted to give you an overview so you had some ground knowledge going forward. All right, let's get started. So the first branch of psychology that we'll be discussing today will be experimental psychology. You'll notice as I'm discussing all these different branches that they tend to overlap quite a bit or relate to one another in a certain way. And you can definitely see that with experimental psychology, which is the reason why I decided to do that one first. It's kind of like the umbrella that all the other branches fall under, since most of them, in order to fully establish their concepts and ideas, had to go through some sort of experimental work first. So for experimental psychology, usually the careers are full-time researchers who work in universities or research labs or in privately funded organizations or corporations. And the whole point of this is to answer some sort of theoretical question that the scientists will now look into to try to find an answer. And oftentimes these questions are based off of others' research, so it's empirical research for the most part, because in this day and age, it's pretty hard to come up with a new concept or idea, considering there's so many people before us who have done all this hard work. So usually it's building upon another researcher's work. And oftentimes these people will pick one question or one problem and they'll work on it for their whole entire career. So you'll notice a lot in writings and psychology literature that if you read one person's work or one person's research articles, usually it's all related to the same topic. And these can span from humans or animals, and it's just kind of answering whatever question they have about them. Early psychologists did not such great stuff to both humans and animals. There are lots of ethical violations, so the American Psychological Association has come up with different ethical rules and guidelines. So if you want to take up an experiment yourself, you should definitely look into those first before practicing. The second branch that we're discussing is clinical psychology. So if you watched last week's video, you would know that's what I'm currently getting my master's degree in. So I'm very excited to start discussing concepts and theories with you guys starting next week about clinical psych and all the different types of things that relate to it. And clinical psychology is all about providing mental health and behavioral care to individuals, groups, families, organizations, just whoever needs it. And the nice thing about clinical psych is that it's very broad. So it's not specific to one sort of group. It's for everyone, regardless of your age, gender, ethnicity, culture. Clinical psych is there to help you with whatever you may need. So for clinical psych, the different types of degrees or careers more so would be different types of therapists, and this can range from just a general therapist to one who has some sort of specialization. So maybe they're just there for children, or they're there for people who have drug abuse issues, or people who have anger issues, or they're there just for couples counseling. It all just kind of depends on the individual who's studying clinical psychology's interests and what they would like to go to. And the four main procedures under clinical psychology is assessment, intervention, consultation, and research. So these four kind of work together to help clinical psychologists create a foundation in order for them to help others. So the third branch is counseling psychology. I won't spend too much time on this because it is pretty similar to clinical psychology, except for the fact that it is not quite as intense as clinical psychology. It doesn't focus on as many hard issues. Usually people who have already pretty decent mental health and don't have any severe problems will choose to go to counseling rather than clinical psychology, because people who are counselors more so would work in like schools and places like that, or and other types of jobs where people aren't as severely impacted by their mental health. So counseling and clinical psychologists are pretty similar, but the only difference really is that clinical psych deals with more hard-pressed issues than counseling does. The fourth one we're discussing today is abnormal psychology, which, as I said before, all these tend to overlap and go together. So abnormal psychology relates pretty heavily to experimental psychology and clinical psychology because most of the disorders that fall under this subsect have a lot of research done on them, and usually they'll go to some sort of therapist or psychiatrist to help them with whatever their problems are. And I have a list here of the different disorders, so I'm looking at that on my computer just so I can make sure I get it right for you guys. So some examples of this, which you guys have probably heard of, are anxiety disorders. And anxiety is pretty common nowadays. A lot of people have it, and a lot of people do misdiagnose themselves as having anxiety. So that's a video I want to do as well further along, talking about the dangers of diagnosing yourself. Obviously, it's necessary for some people who can't afford healthcare, but I'll do a whole video on that for future reference. And also dissociative disorders. One that is commonly talked about is called multiple personality disorder in media, but we don't call it that anymore because there's a lot of negative connotation to that. So now it's called dissociative identity disorder. And there's a lot of other disorders under all of these. I'm just trying to mention the more well-known ones. Different mood disorders. So this would be where depression and bipolar falls under. And then schizophrenia is its own section, and then personality disorders. So different personality disorders can be a narcissist, somebody with borderline personality disorder, and there's plenty of others, which I'll for sure do videos on all of these things later on for you guys. So there is not one singular definition of abnormal psychology. I just listed those first so you guys could get kind of a better understanding of what it's all about, because every psychologist, every school of thought has a different way of thinking about abnormal psychology and defining it for themselves. But in a nutshell, basically, abnormal psychology is for anybody who fits outside of the statistical norm. And the overlap for all of these definitions is basically that if you violate certain social norms, social cues, then you would be more so in abnormal psychology. So I will definitely go more into detail with this because I have pages and pages of notes on abnormal psych, and there's so many different things within it that we can discuss for sure. The fifth branch of psychology we'll be discussing is behavioral psychology. So behavioral psychology is all about processing and discussing and figuring out an individual's different behaviors, obviously, but that can be interpreted through their thoughts, emotions, perceptions, just kind of anything that they're able to either verbalize or show on the outside, because behavioral psychologists don't believe you can measure internal stuff. So that basically means your dreams are something that they don't believe in, or not that they don't believe in, but it's just not something that they believe is measurable. So it's not something they look into, or other different sort of cognitive processes. So this one has a lot of famous psychologists that you guys have probably heard of. So there's B.F. Skinner, John Watson, and Ivan Pavlov. So basically all the conditioning psychologists are a part of this. So it relates to experimental as well. They looked at both human and animal interactions and just how they could train behavior and that type of stuff to come up with their ideas and theories, which we'll for sure do videos on conditioning because that's something that comes up a lot in high school psychology courses. So I'll make sure to help you guys out with those. And there are 4 main applications of behavioral psych. So I won't go into too much detail with these, but I can make videos on them if you guys would like. So applied behavior analysis, cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. And these are 4 different ways to manage behaviors. So just different sorts of things. Like for example, applied behavior analysis is very good for kids with autism because it takes complex tasks and breaks it down step by step. And that's very helpful for most kids with autism. And there are different careers you can go into with this. So it's also pretty heavily related to educational psychology. So if you want to work in education, whether that's in a school or some other sort of way that works for you, being a behavioral psychologist, obviously, and also being a marketing executive. If you work within marketing, obviously, it's very good to understand human behavior and the way people are interested in things. So that could be a good career for you, or even a good thing to study if you're interested in marketing, is to look into behavioral psychology courses. So the 6th branch of psychology is cognitive psychology, and this one came about mainly just to kind of fill the research gap that cognitive psychologists felt was left by behavioral psychology, because they view the brain kind of like a computer, which is around the time the computer was invented was kind of around the time cognitive psychologists popped up. So cognitive psychology is very heavily related to neuroscience because they like to compare the brain and the mind to a computer and think of the mind as an information processor. So what they do is they like to make kind of mind maps and different diagrams and models of different neural functions and different things that go on inside of people's head, kind of like a screenshot of what's going on in your brain, but in a simpler way to understand than just a bunch of drawings of neural pathways and things like that. So they mainly think that psychology should be seen as a science, not like a social science, but as like a natural science. So they use a scientific method for everything in their research and things like that. And two of the main issues and debates within cognitive psychology is free will versus determination and nature versus nurture. So these are two debates which are very, very big. And if you take a psych class, you'll for sure discuss them at some point. And cognitive psychologists go in and do a bunch of research to try to figure these things out to provide us a more qualified answer than the ones that we have now. The seventh branch of psychology that we're discussing is developmental psychology. And these psychologists will look at human growth over a lifetime. So they'll look at perceptual differences, physical differences, personality differences in different age groups and compare them to each other. Also in terms of how they learn, how they interact with each other. Just they really want to understand how humans grow and change as they grow older. So oftentimes these types of studies will look at babies versus adults just to kind of see how humans grow and change from birth. And there's not too much to say about developmental psychology. Of course, it's super interesting and a vast subject as others, but it's an easy branch to understand, so I won't go into too much detail, but we will discuss different theories and concepts in this one as well. And the main careers that work with developmental psychology is teaching, research, and healthcare facilities. So developmental psychology would be super helpful for you if you want to work with old people, just so you can have a better understanding of how they ended up this way, and also probably have more empathy and sympathy towards them in their old age. The last branch of psychology I'll be discussing with you guys today is educational psychology. So educational psychologists usually will work with people who are children or adolescents, so basically school aged, but that doesn't mean that they don't study older age groups as well. Just typically they'll work with people who are busy being educated right now, and that tends to be younger people. And usually they'll look into individual learning differences, instructional processes, and anywhere from people who need help with their learning or who are gifted learners. So anyone who's anywhere on the IQ spectrum and that kind of stuff. And their primary focuses are usually educational technology, instructional design, organizational learning, curriculum development, special education, and gifted students. So educational psychologists kind of cover a lot of bases in terms of how education works. So it is a very good degree to go into if you're interested in working with children or just any school age group, because there are a lot of different things you can do if you're an educational psychologist. And there are two different approaches, which I discussed these two earlier on, so you should have an idea of what they are, and that is behavioral and developmental. All right, thank you guys for watching. I hope everything made sense. If you have any questions, please comment down below. I am happy to answer them. And Hasna will finish off the rest of the list on Friday, and I promise next week we'll come back with a lot of cool concepts and ideas to discuss with you guys. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like the video if you can, and have a great day.